The wind came down the mountain like a living thing, snapping branches and scattering snow across the ridges. Its cry so sharp, it seemed to cut into the bones of anyone who dared walk against it. Nathaniel Briggs stood on the porch of his cabin, with his collar turned up, eyes narrowed against the flurry, waiting for the storm to pass. Those storms in these mountains never truly passed. They only changed shape. He had lived 3 winters here, with nothing but his axe, his rifle, and the silence. And he thought that suited him. Silence asked no questions. And silence did not hurt the way people could. Then he saw a figure moving through the storm. Small at first, staggering, wrapped in a cloak that billowed like a torn sail in the wind. For a long moment he thought the storm was playing tricks. But the figure drew closer, step by step, until it was clear she was no ghost. She was a woman, heavy with child, her hands gripping a canvas satchel in one arm while the other clutched a bundle close to her chest. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had paid for help, true enough, but he had not asked for this. A woman who could hardly climb the ridge in winter, belly swollen, eyes dark and unreadable. When she reached his porch, she leaned on the rail, breathing hard, snow sticking to her lashes. She met his stare without flinching, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "If you want a refund, you will have to wait until spring," she said. "I am not walking back through that storm." Nathaniel looked at her belly, then back to her face. "I did not pay for a child," he answered. She lifted her chin, eyes sharp though her cheeks were pale. "I did not ask you to," she said. "But he is coming either way." The wind screamed between them, carrying her words away like ash, but Nathaniel heard enough. For a moment, neither moved. Then he reached out, took her satchel from her shoulder with surprising gentleness, and turned back into the cabin. The smell of cedar and smoke greeted them, the fire low but still alive. She stepped inside slowly, her cloak stiff with ice, her breath still quick. Nathaniel set her satchel by the fire without another word, then dropped a fresh log into the stove. Flames sparked, light flickered across the rough wooden walls, and he finally spoke. "Supper in 2 hours," he said. "You rest till then." She gave no thanks, only nodded, and lowered herself onto the cot, one hand resting on her belly as though to shield the child within from the storm outside. Nathaniel busied himself at the stove, pretending not to notice the way her fingers trembled when she unlaced her boots, or how she sat with her shoulders stiff, like a woman too used to holding herself against the world. Outside the storm howled on, but inside 2 strangers sat in silence, not yet knowing that silence itself would be the ground on which something new would grow. The storm did not let up for 3 more days, snow piling high against the door until Nathaniel had to shoulder it open each morning just to bring in wood from the stack outside. The woman, who had given her name as Anna, stayed inside near the fire, moving slowly but steady, her hands busy with whatever work she could find. She swept the floor with the old broom, stirred the pot when the stew threatened to burn, and laid the wet cloaks near the hearth to dry. She said little, her voice soft and plain when she did, asking only what needed asking, answering with as few words as possible. Nathaniel did not press her. He was not a man of many words either, and silence had become a habit he trusted more than conversation. At first, it was uneasy silence, the kind that pressed between them at the table, when he spooned out stew, and she broke bread with careful fingers. The only sounds were the scrape of a wooden spoon against a bowl, the crack of logs in the fire, and the howl of wind clawing at the shutters. Nathaniel felt the weight of it each night when he took his place by the fire, whittling bits of pine into shavings, while she sat a few steps away, her hands resting on her belly, her gaze on the flames. Yet in that silence there was something else, something he could not name. Not yet. Days slipped into one another, the storm easing into flurries, then bright cold mornings where the sun flashed sharp against the frozen ridge. Nathaniel showed her how to use the iron stove, how to add the logs without letting smoke fill the room. She watched closely, nodded once, and after that did it herself without asking again. She never complained, not even when her back stiffened as she bent over the wash basin, or when she lingered too long on her feet and had to pause with one hand pressed against her side. Nathaniel saw these things but said nothing. Instead, he made small changes, moving the water bucket closer to the hearth, stacking the firewood inside where she could reach it, without going out into the cold, and setting a stool by the table, so she could sit while she worked. He never told her why he did it, and she never thanked him, but neither of them needed the words. When evening came, he drank his coffee on the porch, steam rising into the sharp air, his eyes drifting to the tree line, where snow still clung heavy to the branches. Inside, he could hear the faint shuffle of her steps, the low clink of bowls being stacked. Her presence filled the cabin in a way he had not expected. Not loud or demanding, but steady, like the sound of the fire itself. The silence that once pressed on him began to feel different. It was still silence, but no longer empty. It had shape now, like the space left by something not yet spoken, waiting for the right time. Nathaniel could not say what would come of it, only that the cabin no longer felt like it belonged to him alone. The nights in the mountains carried their own weight, heavier than the storms and colder than the wind. The cabin stood small against the ridge, a square of faint orange light fighting back the dark. Inside, Nathaniel sat by the stove, axe across his lap, splitting thin strips of kindling. Each crack of wood broke the silence, sharp and quick, before fading back into the hush. Anna had gone to her room hours before, her door pulled nearly shut, the glow of a lantern spilling in a thin line across the floorboards. Nathaniel was used to quiet, but he was not used to sharing it. Every small sound she made, every step, every rustle of fabric pressed against his ears, like something unfamiliar, though not unwelcome. He thought the night would be like the others, until he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it, carried through the thin wood of her door. A muffled sob, more like a breath catching than a cry. The kind of sound a person makes when they are trying their hardest not to be heard. Nathaniel froze where he sat, the axe halfway through a strip of pine. He waited, wondering if it was only the wind, but it came again, quiet and broken, a sorrow that slipped out against her will. For a long moment, he did not move. He was not a man who knew what to do with tears, not his own, not another's. His hands were built for wood and rope and iron, not for comfort. Still, something in him stirred, something he thought had gone dead years ago when the fever took his boy. He set the axe aside and rose slowly, his steps measured as he crossed the floor. He did not knock on her door. He did not speak her name. Instead, he added 2 more logs to the stove outside her room, feeding the fire until the warmth spread through the walls. He filled a tin cup with warm water and placed it on the floor just where she would see it come morning. Then he returned to his chair, lowering himself with a soft creak, and stared into the flames until his eyes burned. He did not sleep until the first light crept pale and gray through the shutters. When Anna opened her door at dawn, her eyes were red, though she held her chin steady as she stepped into the room. The cup was empty where she had left it, set neatly back on the table. What caught her more than the fire still burning strong was the shawl folded clean across the foot of her bed. She had left it there the night before, stained with grease and travel dust, but now it was washed and dried, the wool soft again beneath her fingers. She said nothing of it, and Nathaniel made no mention either, only stoked the morning fire as though it had always been his habit. That day, they ate in the same silence as before. But it was no longer cold silence. Something unseen had shifted, thin as smoke, fragile as glass, yet present all the same. The days turned slower as January dragged across the mountains, the snow still deep around the cabin, though the storms came less often. The silence between Nathaniel and Anna had grown steady, no longer sharp with unease but heavy with something unspoken. She moved through her work with quiet focus, sweeping the floor, boiling linens, stirring stew, her belly growing heavier each week. Nathaniel watched her sometimes from the porch as he drank his coffee, steam rising into the cold air, his eyes drifting back to the dark line of trees, where he once thought he would end his life alone. He told himself he looked at her only out of caution, to be sure she did not falter, but the truth lay closer to the ache in his chest when her face tightened with pain and she carried on without complaint. One evening after supper, the air in the cabin felt thicker, the fire burning low, shadows climbing high along the walls. Nathaniel sat with his knife, carving kindling, his movements slow, while Anna lingered by the stove, her hands folded in her lap. She stared at the flames for a long time before she spoke, her voice soft, each word chosen with care. "My husband died in a labor camp." Nathaniel paused, knife midair, the pine shaving curling against the floor. He did not look at her. Not yet. Only waited. "He was not taken in war," she continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was accused of stealing a sack of flour, but it was not true. He hit a guard, only once, when the man tried to lay hands on me. They dragged him away that night, and by morning he was gone. They said his ribs were broken, that his insides were torn apart. They never let me see him, only gave me back his ring wrapped in a napkin." Her voice trembled but did not break. She held her belly as though bracing herself against the memory. Nathaniel set his knife down, leaned forward, and placed another log in the stove, the sparks leaping, the crackle filling the silence her words left behind. He poured water into a tin cup, his hands steady though his heart pounded, and offered it to her without looking directly at her face. She accepted, her fingers brushing his, warm against his rough skin. "I have not told that story to anyone," she whispered, "but it follows me everywhere, even here." Nathaniel returned to his chair and stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "Them kind of stories got claws," he said after a long moment. "They do not let go easy, but out here they cannot follow as fast." The weight in the air loosened, not gone, but shared. Anna smiled faintly, her eyes worn but grateful, and for the first time her silence seemed lighter. Nathaniel picked up his knife again, the wood steady beneath his hand, though the shadows on the wall looked softer now, as if the past had been named and left behind, if only for one night. The thaw had not yet begun, but the storms eased enough for Nathaniel to ride into town for supplies. He saddled his mare at dawn, the sky pale with cold light, and when he turned he found Anna standing at the barn door, with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She did not ask to go, yet when he said nothing, she fetched her cloak and followed her steps, careful but sure. He did not stop her. The road down the ridge was rough with ice, the horses slipping now and then, and Nathaniel kept a steady hand on the reins, watching her out of the corner of his eye. She sat tall, despite her burden, her face pale but calm, as if she had decided long before that she would not show weakness to anyone, least of all him. When they reached town, the sound of voices struck Anna first, the bustle of men unloading crates, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children darting through the snow-muddied street. It had been months since she had seen so many people, and she drew her cloak tighter, the weight of eyes following her every step. They walked together to the store, Nathaniel striding ahead with his list, Anna pausing now and then to look at ribbons, bolts of cloth, jars of preserves. She touched nothing, only watched, but the watching was enough. It was near the counter that Nathaniel noticed a merchant's eyes linger too long on Anna, the way a man sizes up something not his to claim. Later, outside, he heard whispers carry down the street, voices pitched just low enough to be thought private. "That is the widow from Kansas," one man said, "the one whose husband died in the camp. Thought she vanished." Another muttered, "Living with the mountain man now, no ring, belly near to bursting." Nathaniel's shoulders stiffened. He led Anna down the street without a word, but when he tied the mare outside the saloon and stepped through the swinging doors, his silence broke. The room fell quiet as he entered, boots heavy against the floorboards. He pushed his hat back and met every eye without flinching. "She works for me," he said, his voice steady, cold as riverstone. "She is under my roof. You want trouble? Bring it to me." His words cracked through the air like the first thunder of spring, sharp enough to cut the whispers clean. No one answered, though more than one man looked away. Nathaniel stood there a moment longer, making certain his meaning was clear, then left. Outside, Anna waited by the mare, her eyes on the ground, her hands curled against the fabric of her cloak. When he reached her, she lifted her gaze, unreadable, though he saw the faint tremor in her lips. "You did not have to," she said quietly. He settled the reins in her hand and adjusted the stirrup. "Yes, I did," he answered. She said nothing more, but as they rode back into the mountains, the wind cold against their faces, she glanced at him once. A look not of fear or sorrow, but something else, something almost like trust. The mountain days grew longer, though the snow still lay deep, the sun lingering a little more each evening, spilling gold through the cabin windows. Nathaniel worked with steady hands, not only on the chores that kept them alive, but on quiet tasks he had never thought to do before. At first it was small things. He gathered scraps of wood from the shed and smoothed them into straight pieces. Then he began fitting them together, not saying a word about what he was making. He carried extra feed for the chickens. He stacked wood inside so she would not have to step out into the cold. He even sharpened the scissors she used to cut cloth. Anna noticed these things, though she never spoke of them. She only watched from the hearth or the table, her hands resting on her belly, as if she knew some unspoken care had taken root. One night, when the wind pressed hard against the shutters and the fire burned low, Nathaniel sat hunched beneath the lamp with a bolt of flannel stretched across the table. His shoulders were broad, but his hands moved slow, clumsy with the small work. He held the fabric tight, his tongue pressed to his lip as he tried to cut even strips. The scissors slipped, the edges turned crooked, and his muttered curses filled the quiet. Anna sat in her chair by the stove, her shawl wrapped close, watching him through the glow. At first, she said nothing, only listened to the sound of the cloth tearing unevenly. Then, before she could stop herself, a soft sound escaped her lips. It was laughter, low and surprised, the kind that seemed strange in her own mouth after so long without it. Nathaniel looked up at once, startled, the scissors frozen in his hand. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "That poor cloth," she said. "It looks more fit for a scarecrow than a cradle." He grunted, embarrassed, his ears burning though he tried to hide it. "I ain't no seamstress," he muttered. "No, you are not," she said, still smiling. "But you are trying. That counts." He lowered his gaze back to the fabric, cutting another crooked strip, though his lips curved at the edge as if her laughter had left its mark. In the days that followed, more small changes appeared. A cradle swung from a beam near the window, its cedar frame bent smooth, its lining stitched uneven but soft. Anna ran her fingers along the wood one morning, her breath catching at the sight, though she did not speak. Later, she found a jar of herbs left by the stove, ones known to ease pain and calm breath, though Nathaniel never admitted he had asked the midwife in town. When she saw him outside mending the roof with patches more careful than before, she felt something stir, something warmer than duty. At supper, when their eyes met across the table, she did not look away as quickly. Her smile was still small, but it stayed, and Nathaniel, though silent as ever, felt something thaw in the long winter cabin, as if her laughter had cracked the ice for good. The storm came down the mountain like a wall of white fury, the wind shrieking through the pines, snow striking the cabin until the shutters rattled like bones. By nightfall, the cabin was buried to its windows, the door pushed shut with drifts so high Nathaniel had to brace it with a beam. The sound was relentless, as if the world beyond their walls had been swallowed whole. Inside, the fire burned steady, and Anna sat near the hearth with her shawl around her shoulders, her face pale though calm. Nathaniel pretended to read, his eyes flicking to her more than to the page, a knot tightening in his chest he could not name. It was past midnight when it began. Anna doubled forward with a sharp breath, one hand gripping the table, her knuckles white against the wood, her face twisted, her voice low but tight. "It is time," she whispered. Nathaniel was on his feet before the words had finished, the book falling forgotten to the floor. He knew there was no chance of reaching the midwife, not through a storm like this. Fear clawed at him, but he forced it down. "Now," he said, his voice rough, steadying her arm as another wave of pain bent her forward. She nodded once, her eyes set with a strength that startled him even in the midst of it. He cleared the table with one sweep, flour and salt scattering across the floorboards. then spread blankets and boiled water as the book had told him. His hands shook so hard he nearly dropped the kettle. Anna sank to the bed, gripping the frame as though it was the only thing holding her to the earth. Her breath came fast, sharp gasps breaking into cries she tried to bite back. Nathaniel wiped her brow with a damp cloth, whispering words he hardly knew he had. "You are strong. You can do this. Just breathe, hold on." Hours stretched like days. Sweat drenched her hair, her face drawn with pain so fierce it bent her nearly in two. Nathaniel followed the words scrawled in the old manual, each step clumsy but desperate. When the moment came, he urged her with all the force in his voice. "Push! Damn it! Push!" Her scream tore through the cabin, louder than the storm outside. And then the child slipped into his hands, small and limp, too quiet. Terror ripped through him. He turned the boy over, patted his back. Nothing. The book's words blurred before his eyes. "Clear the airways." His hands trembled as he pressed his lips to the tiny mouth, drew in the bitter fluid, spat it onto the floor, again and again. Then a sputter, a weak cry, thin but alive. Nathaniel's knees nearly buckled, his chest shaking with sobs he bit back. He wrapped the boy in a towel and laid him against Anna's chest. Her hands moved at once, weak but certain, her fingers brushing the child's cheek. Her eyes shone with tears, her breath ragged but steady. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, a new sound rose, soft and trembling. The cry of a newborn child, alive against all odds, filling the silence with a fragile hope Nathaniel had thought he would never hear again. The storm passed with a strange stillness, leaving the cabin buried in drifts and the mountains wrapped in silver silence. Inside, the fire burned low, and Nathaniel sat in the rocking chair with the newborn in his arms, his broad frame bent close, his voice low and rough as he hummed an old tune. Anna stirred on the bed, her body worn and heavy but alive, her eyes opening to see the sight she had never expected. The man who had once greeted her with suspicion, now holding her child as though he were carved from glass. The boy's tiny breaths puffed against Nathaniel's chest, and when he shifted, the baby's fist curled around the coarse fabric of his shirt. Later, when Anna slept again, Nathaniel carried the boy to the table where his tools lay. He set the child gently in the cradle he had built, the cedar wood creaking as it swayed, and he picked up his knife. The block of pine in his hand felt solid, the blade sharp as it bit into the grain. Slowly, with a care he had not shown in years, he carved letters, each stroke deep and certain. M-I-C-A-H, the same name he had once carved long ago, though that child had been taken by fever before he could walk. His throat tightened as he traced the letters with his thumb, but this time the name felt different. It was not a monument to loss, but a promise of life. When Anna woke, she saw the wood block resting on the table beside the cradle. She rose carefully, her body aching, and crossed the room to lift it. Her fingers brushed the rough letters, her breath catching as she read the name. She turned toward Nathaniel, who stood near the stove with his hands still marked by wood shavings, his gaze steady but uncertain. "Micah," she whispered, testing the sound of it. Nathaniel nodded once, his jaw tight. "That was my boy's name," he said, voice low. "He did not live long. Thought I would never say it again." Anna looked at him for a long moment, her eyes soft, though glistening with tears. She held the block close to her chest, then looked down at the baby sleeping soundly in the cradle, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the fire's crackle. "You gave it back," she said quietly. "Not just the name, but the meaning." Nathaniel shifted, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, unsure of what to say. But the silence between them no longer pressed heavy. It warmed the air, like the steady glow of the fire, filling the cabin with something unspoken yet whole. That evening, they shared their meal at the table, the child nestled near the hearth, his soft cries quick to fade as the cradle rocked. Anna caught Nathaniel's eyes across the lamplight, and instead of looking away, she let her smile linger. He answered it, small but real, and in that simple moment, the cabin, once built on silence and grief, became a place where life had begun again. The spring thaw had begun, slow and muddy, the snow slipping from the eaves in heavy clumps and the ground softening beneath the pines. The cabin no longer looked like a place meant only for survival, but for something steadier, something that might last. Nathaniel chopped wood in the yard, while Anna sat on the porch, with Micah cradled in her arms, the baby's small hand curled around her finger. It was then that the sound of hooves carried up the ridge, a steady rhythm that did not belong to any neighbor. Nathaniel set down the axe, his eyes narrowing as a rider came into view, tall in the saddle, his coat gray and his brass badge catching the light. The man dismounted with deliberate slowness, brushing snow and mud from his boots as though the mountain itself offended him. He looked at Nathaniel with eyes that measured and weighed, then tipped his hat with a politeness that did not reach his face. "Mr. Briggs," he said, voice crisp and sharp. "Edgar from the Territorial Records Office. We had notice from a neighbor of certain concerns." Nathaniel said nothing, only waited, his shoulders squared. Edgar's gaze shifted to Anna on the porch, her shawl drawn tight, Micah stirring faintly against her chest. "A woman under your roof, no license of marriage filed, now a child," the agent continued. "That complicates things." Anna rose slowly, her body still healing but her stance steady. She stepped off the porch, her feet sinking in the soft ground, and faced the man without lowering her eyes. "I am not hiding," she said calmly, her voice quiet but firm. Edgar gave her a thin smile, as though her words amused him. "Never said you were, ma'am, but the law is clear. Residency without documentation invites review. We are not here to punish, only to prevent problems before they grow." His gaze slid back to Nathaniel. "So, is she your legal spouse?" The question hung heavy in the air, the wind whispering through the pines, the baby shifting with a small cry. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, his voice steady when he answered, "She is my wife in all but name." Edgar arched a brow. "In all but name is not a binding phrase." Nathaniel stepped forward, his boots sinking into the thawing ground, his tone hard as stone. "Then I will make it law." His eyes did not waver, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had decided. Edgar studied him, pen scratching across the small ledger he carried, then snapped it shut. "You have 2 weeks to file proper witnesses," he said, mounting his horse once more. "Good day to you both." When the man rode off down the trail, the stillness he left behind felt heavy. Anna turned toward Nathaniel, her eyes searching his face. "You did not have to say that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," he answered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver ring, dulled with time, the engraving crooked but clear. "Grace found." He held it out, his voice rough. "Not perfect, but true." Anna's breath caught as she slipped it onto her finger, the weight of it real, the meaning even more so. And for the first time since the storm, she smiled without hesitation. Spring came slow to the high country, seeping in with soft drips of water from the roof, and the steady trickle of streams loosening from their ice. The snow pulled back inch by inch, leaving behind patches of dark earth and stubborn green shoots pushing through. The air still held its bite, but the sun lingered longer each day, warming the cabin walls and casting golden light across the worn floorboards. Inside, life shifted with the season. Micah's cries had grown stronger, no longer fragile but full of insistence, his tiny fists waving as though he was already reaching for the world. Anna moved with him, pressed close, her steps steadier now, her laughter breaking the silence like a bell when he grabbed hold of her hair or wriggled free of the blanket she tried to keep him in. Nathaniel worked with a lighter rhythm than before, his axe rising and falling at the woodpile with steady precision, his shoulders loose where once they had been tight with solitude. He dug a garden patch behind the cabin, turning the soil dark and rich with the same care he gave to the chickens and the firewood. Anna knelt beside him in the dirt, her apron stained with earth, her hands planting beans and carrots in neat rows. Sometimes her hair slipped loose from its braid and brushed her cheek, and Nathaniel would find himself watching her longer than the work required. She noticed once, her lips curving into a smile not faint or guarded but full, and he looked away quickly, though his chest felt strangely light. The cabin itself changed with them. A clothesline stretched between the pines, linen fluttering in the mountain breeze. Herbs hung drying near the stove, filling the air with the scent of sage and mint. A wooden rattle Nathaniel had carved sat near Micah's cradle, its edges worn smooth by small hands. The silence that had once pressed down on them was gone, replaced by the hum of daily life, the sound of Anna humming old tunes while she kneaded bread, the crack of Nathaniel's hammer mending the porch rail, the soft giggle of a baby discovering his own voice. They still spoke little, but their words were no longer needed to carry meaning. When Nathaniel returned from town with sugar and cloth, Anna left the lantern burning in the window until he came back. When she found her boots near the stove, warmed before the morning frost, she only touched his arm in thanks. When he carved a stool for her to sit while she worked, she set his coffee near his chair each evening without asking. It was a language of gestures, of silences, that no longer carried emptiness, but something stronger, something like belonging. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridge and painted the mountains lavender and gold, Anna sat on the porch with Micah on her lap. Nathaniel finished splitting wood and leaned his axe against the stump, his gaze drawn to the sight of her laughing freely at something the baby had done. He felt the sound ripple through him, steady and sure, and he knew the thaw had not just touched the land. It had reached him too, softening the hard edges he thought would never yield, and he found himself smiling without even knowing it. A year slipped by in the rhythm of seasons. The cabin no longer a place meant only for shelter, but a home breathing with life. The garden behind the house stretched in green rows, beans climbing their stakes, carrots and turnips pushing stubbornly through the soil. A clothesline swayed between the pines with shirts so small they looked more like dolls' garments fluttering in the mountain breeze. The chickens clucked noisily each morning, and the smell of bread drifted through the door by afternoon. Micah crawled across the floorboards on hands and knees, chasing the bright streaks of sunlight that moved across the room, his laughter tumbling after him as wild and untamed as the mountain air. Anna's face had changed with the months. The weariness that once clung to her eyes had softened into something lighter. Dirt streaked her cheeks when she worked the garden, and ribbons appeared in her hair, red or blue depending on her mood. She moved with purpose and calm, her smile unguarded now, spilling freely whenever Micah surprised her with his first halting steps, or whenever Nathaniel said something in his dry, steady way that was not meant to be funny, but somehow was. Nathaniel himself carried the change in his shoulders. They no longer held the weight of solitude, but bent now toward the work of building, mending, planting, providing. His axe swung lighter, his steps slower when he came up the ridge from town, his eyes not searching for escape, but returning always to the cabin. He had learned to carve more than wood. He carved time into the evenings, placing his tools aside to sit at the table while Anna hummed and Micah babbled in his mother's lap. He carved gentleness into his hands, lifting the boy high until laughter spilled from the child like sunlight breaking through cloud. As the year closed, the mountains turned green with spring again, and on a soft evening, the family gathered on the porch. The sky stretched wide, painted in gold and lavender, the peaks glowing like embers against the horizon. Anna sat in the rocking chair Nathaniel had built. Micah nestled against her chest, his small hand curled around her finger. Nathaniel lowered himself beside her, his broad frame tired from the day's work but steady, his eyes on the land he had once thought would bury him. Slowly, he reached for her hand. She let him take it, their fingers folding together with a natural ease, her head resting against his shoulder. The world felt steady in that moment, not because it was safe or easy, but because they had chosen to remain, to endure, to build. Some stories did not end with gunfire or glory, but with quiet redemption found in the arms of those who dared to stay. Nathaniel breathed deep, Anna smiled against his sleeve, and Micah stirred, murmuring something half like a dream, half like a promise. If this story warmed your heart, stay with us on Western Love Legends. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment so we know you are out there, listening to these tales of grit, grace, and love that grows where nothing else dares. And remember, even the toughest mountain man might one day learn how to sew a crooked little hat.